Hello, this is Stephen. Thanks for tuning in to the Bureau of Lost Culture. If this is your first time, welcome. If you've been here before, you will know that there's nothing that we like better here than a story of lost culture. A story of music under repression and a story of human endeavour. And we have such a story today, and what a story it is. In the swinging 1960s, after nearly a century of colonisation by the French, Cambodia had gained its independence and was ready to rock. Young musicians from the countryside flocked to the vibrant cosmopolitan capital city of Phnom Penh. Teenagers cycled along the Mekong River, guitars slung across their backs, on their way to rehearse Khmer covers of the Beatles or Pink Floyd. The city was a melting pot of sound, old-fashioned rock and roll, early heavy metal, crooners and swooners, and love duets. But the music stopped on the 17th of April 1975. The Khmer Rouge army captured Phnom Penh, ending the civil war and beginning a genocide. Around 90% of the musicians died in the killing fields. A few fled to the US or France, taking what remained of their music with them. I first came across this story a few years back when we were curating a film programme for our X-ray audio project, with which it has some parallels. But more of that in a second. I wanted just to point you at bureauoflostculture.com, particularly if you haven't been here before. You can check out all that we do there. I wanted to say thanks to Roger, Judy and Tim for their support this month, and to Ronnie Lambert for keep sending me amazing videos connected with the counterculture. Thanks Ronnie, keep it up. You don't have to support us by giving hard cash, although that of course is very welcome. You can make suggestions or just sign up for our newsletter, The Countercultural Times. So back to it. The story that I mentioned of the lost music of Cambodia has been covered in detail by an incredible new book. It's called Away from Beloved Lover, which is the title of one of the hits of that golden era of Cambodian pop and rock and roll. And its author, DEE PEYOK, is with me to talk about that era, but also to talk about her journey, her odyssey into the heart of darkness and into the heart of light of those wonderful tunes, those wonderful musicians, and those wonderful days that were brutally brought to an end. Here she is. Hello, Dee.
Hi.
First of all, congratulations on this book. It is quite something. Fascinating, grim at times, tragic, also funny, and a sort of personal odyssey through some beautiful music and the beautiful times, but also the sort of darkness of the human psyche as well, right? Is
That's a beautiful summary. I mean, I think it's, for me, it was so important to tell the story of Cambodia, that it's more than just the Khmer Rouge, it's more than just the killing fields, which I think is kind of, a level of knowledge for a lot of people, but, there's so much more to Cambodia, and Cambodian culture has fascinated me for such a long time.
Well, I think we should come back to that fascination, but in terms of, the content and the music that you write about, I think it is a surprise, probably for most of us, to realise that there was this extremely rich modern musical history. I mean, we probably think, Cambodia, lots of sort of folk music and stuff, but we're talking about swing, we're talking about rock and roll, we're talking about crooners, swooners, the twist, cha-cha-cha, very heavily Western influenced music, but I don't think many of us have been aware that what a kind of rich and original culture it was in Cambodia in those years, right?
In Cambodia, they talk about two kind of cultural golden ages, and they talk about the first being sort of the Angkorian period, where we think about Angkor Wat and we think about the temples and what, Cambodia is famous for around the world. And, and with that came music and this rich historic culture. And then we have the sort of second coming of the Golden Age, as they call it, which is the period called Sanctum Restronium. And this is between 1955 and 1970.
We're going to fill out some of that history of the times that you described then. But I wanted in a way to read something from the book, which is one of your interviewees talking to you about the kind of end of that Golden Age, really, and then sort of cycle backwards from there. So this is your interviewee, Keo Sinan, is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
Whenever the bombs came, I ran with my 45 RPM records and the clothes on my back. I didn't care about saving anything else, I had to save my records. Sinan is a session drummer from Kampong Thom province in central Cambodia. In the early 1970s, when civil war closed the clubs in Phnom Penh, he was forced to move back to the countryside to find work. By 1974, his village was under the control of the Khmer Rouge, and it was too dangerous to have records. People who were found with records were killed because they didn't allow people to listen to popular music anymore, he tells me. Our village leader asked everyone to bring any music records to them to be destroyed. At the time, I'd been put in charge of planting vegetables, so I hid my records in metal boxes in an abandoned outhouse near my home. I didn't bury them, as they would have been destroyed with no air getting to them, so I put them in loose plastic bags inside metal boxes. The outhouse contained chemical fertiliser, and because of all the poisonous chemicals and pesticides, people were reluctant to go near it. I visited the outhouse once a week to check on the records, always around noon, when most people stayed indoors to escape the heat. One time, a Khmer Rouge officer summoned me to tell me that he had heard that I was in possession of all records, and that if I did have these records, I should not have them, as they were prohibited. I told them that all my records were lost when my house burned down after being bombed. But 2 officers kept visiting my house and investigating. I was so frightened, I gave them both watches as a gift. There was constant danger. As we were just saying before we started, that touched me because, of course, I spent so long investigating the subject of underground forbidden music in the Soviet Union. And I think for a lot of people listening to this who imagine deep music lovers and possibly record collectors as well, that's very touching because that's somebody who their music is so important to them. In fact, in this case, their records are so important to them that they are taking pretty drastic risks to save those of all their cultural possessions, in fact, of all their possessions. That's quite powerful, isn't it?
It's really powerful, and I think because he lived in the countryside in an area that was occupied by the Khmer Rouge 2 years earlier than the cities. The image of him running when the bombs were coming with records to save them was just so powerful to me. And just the image of him kind of tending to these records. He was a vegetable farmer during the Khmer Rouge, and he's sort of by day tending to these vegetables, and then he'd sneak off and tend to his records at noon every day religiously, and and we're talking about quite a few years that he did that. If it weren't for people like Sinan, a lot of this music would have got lost. I mean, there were stories that I recount in the book about children throwing records into the rivers like frisbees, and because they didn't have anything to play it on, and they didn't know. Some of them were young enough not to know what a record was. So much was lost. There was a lot of there was burning of books, similar to the Nazis. There was the libraries were dynamited, the banks as well. So there was this idea about bringing everything back to year zero during Khmer Rouge times. People literally hid things in nooks and crannies in buildings, and then they were evacuated out of the cities, and many of them didn't come back. And those that did, they might not have had a claim to their previous property. And then there's the refugee movement, and everything gets spread out around the world that they did manage to hide and keep during those times in terms of records, So there's only a fraction left of what was once there.
Well, why don't we hear one of those fractions? Give us a song.
I think we'll have a song from Rosary Satir. One of those songs that's always, kind of stood out for me. It's a garage rock song. It's called I'm 16. It translates as Chnam Undok Pramoy. And it's all about the kind of buoyancy of youth and the excitement, you feel at that age.
Well, you talk about other people, who, you know, basically destroyed their own records and music and other sort of ephemera because they feared being found with them, and because you'd been facing execution, right? So if you'd held on to them. What's extraordinary for me, of course, is that we're really talking about 1974, 1975. The period I was talking about was 20 years early, 1955, you know, the Stalinist terror in the Soviet Union. So 75, in this country, punk is kicking off. It's starting to feel like history, but, you know, for a lot of people, that feels like part of the, you know, relatively recent times, right? But Dee, let's fill out the story up to then. So we started there, you know, with one of your interviewees and talking about the coming of the Khmer Rouge, but maybe you could just fill out, you know, from the French occupation of Cambodia, because it was a protectorate, wasn't it, part of, like, you could say, the French Empire in some way, so that we know how it came to these dire times.
So it was 90 years, I think, was the length of time that it was a French protectorate in Cambodia. And at this, you know, you've got the French, you know, colonising Vietnam at the same time. Cambodia was always that sort of buffer zone and caught up in geopolitics for a lot of its history. And the Khmer Empire, going back much further, was spread over Thailand, Laos. You know, it was a huge, powerful empire. So the relationship between all these different neighbouring countries is quite fraught. Starting with the French protectorate, we've got, you know, a period of time where you had the French investing in roads, but not particularly in education or anything that really would benefit people outside of the cities. And then those that, you know, were wealthier in the cities were sort of really caressed and charmed by the French, you know, to kind of bring them on side, really. So the kind of the ruling classes, the elite, the kind of middle to upper classes in Cambodian society, very influenced by French culture. And French signs on the streets. There was a lot of French, you know, kind of influence on food, for example, and also the lycée sort of school system as well. You know, that was from the French protectorate time, and that still kind of exists.
So you had that split, didn't you, between the kind of elite Cambodians, the sort of upper middle class, who were sort of very much allied culturally with the sort of French overlords, and then the sort of big gap, and then the kind of more rural population, which was, you know, kind of peasant population, right? And I suppose in some ways that split in later decades proved to be catastrophic, right? Yeah,
and I think the influence with America during the war, where, you know, the bombs are splitting the people from kind of the countryside, where, you know, who experience a lot more of the bombs and the bombings campaigns, particularly in the east, because it was all to do with trying to kind of stop the Viet Cong and their kind of supply lines. You know, again, another outside kind of power coming in and creating more of a divide between what the Khmer Rouge called old people and new people. Right. The city people and the old, you know,
the
being
metropolitan
the new.
and the rural. But the French left peacefully, didn't they? It was a kind of peaceful transition, and, you know, there wasn't a kind of huge, like a war of independence or anything, right?
There wasn't, but, you know, the Japanese occupied Cambodia during the Second World War, so they lost a lot of that hold, the French, and so it was a kind of easing out after that occurred. And you have Sihanouk, who was this charismatic pick, really, from the French. They picked, you know, they plucked him out of the royal family, picked out as kind of someone that they thought was quite malleable, but actually turned out to be quite the opposite. By 55, he'd abdicated the throne, and he was very popular with the people. He was a real populist leader.
And really, that's kind of, in a way, where the sort of musical story that you tell starts, isn't it? So tell us about that. Tell us about the dawn of this new golden age.
Starting with Norodom Sihanouk, who was originally King Norodom Sihanouk, then abdicated, became prince, was still very much in name by the people, the king, for all his years until his death. He saw kind of culture as a vehicle to kind of modernise Cambodia, and he was personally very interested in it. He was a singer, he was a musician, he was a film director. He got a lot of criticism for that as well, you know, when the bourgeoisie sort of turned on him towards the end of his reign, because his focus, they saw it as too much on that, his pleasure pursuits, than actually leading the country. But I mean, he nationalised a lot of things as well, and just invested a lot in architecture, and it became known as the Pearl of the Orient. You know, Singapore was inspired some of its architecture from Phnom Penh. So, a leader for a time in Southeast Asia of culture and modernism, and there was just a lot of investment in education, and government officers were sent abroad to France to study. So it was a time of mobilisation and movement, energy and a lot of change.
In terms of musical culture, the first kind of wave of homegrown bands start to get influenced, first of all, by kind of French, like French chanson, isn't it? That's for French music anyway. That's the first kind of Western major influence that comes in.
I think jazz as well, kind of in the 50s, you've got Edith Piaf was huge there, and so you have these samba and all these other kind of influences coming in the 50s. And then, the radio starting up, growing throughout the kind of late 50s, and then we get to the early 60s, and that's when it all takes off. And then surf guitar starts, the Shadows went on tour.
Shadows, massive sort of influence, right?
Massive.
They were not just in terms of the music, but in terms of like the outfits and these kind of choreographed sort of movements on stage, right?
Exactly.
Just say a little bit about Sinsamuth, because he's such a figure, isn't he, throughout this whole thing? I mean, I was trying to think of a comparison that people might be able to get hold of. It's sort of like almost like a cross between Cliff Richard and Elvis. I mean, it's, in terms of stature, absolutely massive, right? And also, but went through these kind of different phases, didn't he, right the way through to the 70s? But maybe you could talk a little bit about him.
I mean, his career was 20 years long. He was a real chameleon, and that's how he kept kind of at the forefront of culture at that level, kind of reigning over the whole music industry throughout that period. But he started in the late 50s as that chanson sort of type, crooner, and then he was part of the Palace Orchestra, and so he had these quite traditional kind of roots. He came from the north, from a very impoverished sort of background. He had a musical dream, followed it. He was a nurse. He went to Phnom Penh to work, and then kind of was moonlighting on the side doing sort of shows, and then started getting involved in radio, and this sort of grew throughout the late 50s, and then by kind of 62 he has his first hit, which is called Champa Bantamong, and it's still very much the soundtrack to Cambodia. It's rare that you go through a day listening to radio or being on a bus and listening to some karaoke or being in Cambodia without hearing that song.
បាននំបងបណ្ដូលចិនអើយខ្ញុំសូមលាហើយលាទាំងអាឡាយតាំងពីខ្លួនខ្ញុំបានឃ្លាតទៅឆ្ងាយខ្វល់ខ្វាយនឹកស្ដាយពុំមានពេលឡាអូបាននំបងកងកម្មវាសនាដែលខ្ញុំប្រាថ្នាគ្មានពេលទំនេរ
Terrific. So we're going to talk more about him because, as you said, this chameleon who 20 years career and stuff, and managed to navigate the times, didn't he, quite successfully. I also like your these little pictures that you give. It's still largely quite a poor economy and stuff, but you talk about taxi drivers gather outside the radio station when they're having their break, don't they? And then the radio station puts this speaker outside so they can listen to tunes, right?
That's right. I mean, they had, the old traditional kind of, speakers on a pole, sort of on street corners, and you have the cyclo drivers who are kind of these carriage drivers on bicycle. Their silhouette is so beautiful, and you still see them in Cambodia now, although they are a kind of dying breed. They're taken out by the kind of the motorised vehicles now, but they're still there. Some of them in the 60s, they would be gathering around these kind of speakers on their break, listening to the radio, and back then it's one channel, and it's a programme throughout the day, usually with Sinsamuth somewhere in there. Another singer called Siang Di, who is a female singer who started her career at about 14 and went on to marry a prince. Usually them duetting on some kind of romantic sort of ballad and talking programmes as well. And then as more investment came in from the outside, particularly from China, from Russia as well, the radio infrastructure grew and the airwaves grew and they were able to kind of have radios transistor radios in homes, and at that point things really were changing.
I think you mentioned too about workers having transistors strapped to their heads whilst they were working, a sort of early version of an iPod.
That was something I'd heard about, rubber workers strapping them to their heads as they worked. I just love that image.
Yeah, that's dedication. We love that. So you mentioned then, see, we've had the sort of crooners, and then the cha-cha-cha, that was an important thing. The twist, wasn't there a huge hit with a kind of chubby checker takeoff?
There was. So Chum Kem was kind of the forerunner to Sinsismut, and he went to study ceramics in Italy and came back with from his training with a chubby checker record. And he'd started recording a little bit in Italy, and had a very smooth kind of crooner voice too, but he brought back the twist, and he had a song called Twist Twist Knyam, and it took off, and it sort of was, outrageous to the establishment at the time, who, there was some wonderful letters that I read from kind of the old guard writing into to one national newspaper about the outrageousness of Chum Kem and his hips.
Well, I mean, obviously that was a big theme too in the Soviet Union, and there was sort of the rhythms, certain rhythms seemed to get the authorities in a real fluster, because the idea was that it would incite the wrong kind of passions in young people, in particular, when they should be getting on with building the new nation. But actually, it wasn't just there. It was actually here too, and in America too, wasn't it? Elvis is lambasted by certain groups of society, the devil's music and all that stuff. It was the time, wasn't it? But in Phnom Penh in particular, and possibly other places in Cambodia, there was a nightclub culture, wasn't there? Real swinging 60s stuff, actually, right? Fashion, parties. Maybe you could say something about the kind of the moral shift that happened here, in terms of, say, sexual freedoms and development of women's rights and stuff. Was that also going on in Cambodia too, amongst the metropolitan elite at least?
Completely. So you have, some of the more traditional kind of artists who barely moved on stage and, kind of stuck with that kind of more traditional sort of jazz sound. And then you had kind of the new coming in the mid-60s with people like Pen Ron. She was definitely a kind of feminist amongst female kind of artists, and she was quite satirical in her kind of lyrics, and she was very independent, and there's a lot of humour in her lyrics too. But she really got into go-go and into, the miniskirt, and her and Sieng Bang Ti, another one, were the forerunners for that whole kind of thing. And, Sinsismut, he was, like I said, the chameleon, who he released a lot of go-go songs too. Did
a go-go album, no?
He may have, yeah. I mean, I know there's probably an album's worth of go-go songs for sure.
I think it's time for another tune.
Next we have one of the Draka songs. This is from 1974. This is Sarawan Chan Pen Boramai, which means dancing the Sarawan under the moon. Dục nínประจันพลืดลาจะจำโพลทาจันเป็นโบรมัยníนประจันพลืดลาจะจำโพลทาจันเป็นโบรมัยมันยืงจะต่อยังไงยังกันได้มาพึ่งเนียมาดอนับไม้ก็พร้อมในมาดองอ้อยบ้านริกรีประจันระมูลกรอล้องประจันเป็นคงนั้นเลือเมฆีประจันระมูลกรอล้องประจันเป็นคงนั้นเลือเมฆีมัดแดงยึกแดงอ่องเนียเป็นเรือผู้ร้อนสารบันความคมเพราะกันสารบันจันเป็นบรมัย
I was interested the speed at which these new Western, let's call them that, musical forms were taken up in Cambodia. The difference, I noticed one difference anyway between that and what happened a bit later in the Soviet Union, where also, as after Khrushchev and the Thaw dances and musical themes also came to the Soviet Union, but in Cambodia it's apparent that quite quickly they were making it their own with their own lyrics, for instance, I mean, what happened in the Soviet Union is that when they were singing like Beatles songs in English very badly, and certainly the people that I met who were the sort of proper underground music fans were incredibly dismissive of that. You know, they didn't want to hear like Russian bands pretending to be the Beatles by singing in English. They wanted their own homegrown stuff, which came later. But in Cambodia, they were doing some stuff in English, but they were actually writing their own lyrics. And it's quite interesting that you said then about that artist. She was not only singing, but she was writing her own lyrics and music. Is that right?
She's the only female artist I know of that really did that, apart from another one called Po Vannery, who was much later in the 70s. They would cover these songs and they would change the lyrics and they would sing in Khmer to begin with. And it was during the Sankan Restonium period up to 1970, it was sort of outlawed to kind of sing in English. But in the 70s, they were allowed to, and it was encouraged. So anything you hear with some English lyrics is most likely to be the 70s.
Why was it kind of illegal, as it were, to sing in English?
It was some policy that Sihanouk, head of state, brought in, but I think it was to kind of really
encourage a homegrown
culture. Exactly.
It's a bit like in France, isn't it? They've still got, like, I think, a law in France, haven't they? They've got to play a certain amount of French language music on the radio. I'm in favour of that, by the way.
Yeah, me too.
Right, so that did encourage it, in fact, didn't it? And so this homegrown Cambodian sounds is quite different, isn't it? Very particular, isn't it?
And that's one of the things that's always drawn me to it, is that you can hear in some of the recordings, you can hear the tro, which is a violin, a traditional Khmer instrument, and that's kind of blending with Western instruments. And there's an artist called Mo Kenyol who is the guitar player for the band Baxi Cham Krong, a surf rock band, and they were the first sort of guitar band. He would impersonate Cambodian instruments on his electric guitar.
As the 60s wear on, and as different musical styles are coming in the West, the sort of the Stones and the later Beatles, and that more kind of rocky sound, that also gets taken up, doesn't it? So they move on from the kind of groovy 60s kind of slightly lightweight cha-cha-chas and that into this heavier sound, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's a lot of that is the influence from the Vietnam War and military radio, American military radio being picked up. There's songs like, The Animals, you start hearing covers of their music. Santana later was huge in Cambodia, and they just, for some reason, really drawn to Santana. Since Smoot did a cover of Black Magic Woman. So there's a harder rock sound coming in kind of the late 60s into the 70s.
Yeah, I think also let's flip into sort of some political history, because America gets involved with Vietnam around about 1965, right? And as you mentioned earlier, Cambodia, which had, desperately in a way tried to maintain its neutrality, but it's surrounded by these kind of countries where there's lots of conflict going on. A lot of so-called South Vietnam runs up its east side, doesn't it? You've got Laos to the north, North Vietnam sort of beyond that. This sort of shameful story of the Vietnam War started to affect them. I get the impression that America was bombing, as you said, inside Cambodia pretty much without consent, as far as you can tell, right? They were just doing it, weren't they, to try and cut off the Viet Cong supply lines. And it's that, so this kind of pretty desperate impact on Cambodia.
The bombing campaigns were catastrophic, and they were, the scale of them wasn't really known until Clinton declassified records not too long ago. So US soldiers were sort of sworn to secrecy. You know, there was a lot was unsaid for decades about the extent of the bombing, but it was used by politicians in Cambodia, to Khmer Rouge particularly, who were a guerrilla army throughout the early 70s, and then took power in 75. They used that to kind of basically recruit soldiers and recruit people in the provinces to their side and to their cause, because they were losing their homes and they were losing their families.
Another catastrophic foreign intervention, you know, and of course had the opposite effect of what it was supposed to, because it just basically radicalised a lot of people. Sort of Sihanouk gets deposed, doesn't he? I guess he was seen as being not very effective politically and allowing various things to happen. But this right-wing government comes in that's actually kind of supported by America, right?
They are, and I think, you know, Sihanouk was sort of walking this tightrope politically for years, with sort of turning a blind eye to the Viet Cong, using their supply lines in the jungles in the east, and keeping America on side at the same time in South Vietnam. So he was walking this political tightrope between the two sides. And then, you know, you have America saying, right, we've had enough. And people that weren't too happy with Sihanouk sort of, you know, eyes on his personal pursuits, his cultural pursuits, his populist sort of behaviour. And so it was when he was on a kind of...
he was in Moscow, right?
He was in Moscow,
his cousin sort of seized his power, right?
Yeah, so it was his cousin who was sort of the kind of the puppet master, really. And then you had Lon Nol, who was the sort of malleable, chosen kind of leader from the American side. And it was a coup that, while Sihanouk was in Moscow, went on, and then he was banished, and he went straight to China.
Tried to get sort of backing from them to get back in power, right? But
exactly.
Strangely, this right-wing coup backed by the Americans did actually musically in it had a sort of strange effect in it, because all this American music that's piling into Cambodia, right? And of course that affects the local scene, right? So you get this new style of music emerging, right?
And I think, you know, during Sihanouk's time there was a lot of propaganda music anyway,
Right.
you know, songs about places and power of Cambodia. But then, you know, the 70s, when you have the Lon Nol government, it's a military government, and so you have this kind of new movement with songs that are drafting soldiers in their lyrics, and you know, musicians were told to, you know, don military uniforms. They were given, you know, ranks. They were, you know, so you had this harder sound and a change in lyrics from kind of the wonders of Cambodia and love, and, you know, all the things of Sihanouk's time to
Don't be ashamed to kill. That was one lyric,
Yes,
wasn't it? You know,
yeah.
and women sort of take up rifles, and at the same time, I mean, some pretty. It sounds a bit sort of superficial to say, but some pretty cool artists as well, right?
yeah.
So obviously, without having the benefit of speaking Khmer, you know, you just listen to the music and it's pretty cool, right? Hard rock stuff.
One of my favourites is Your Solarang. He had a cover of Gloria, but most of his songs were originals, and, you know, a lot of garage rock songs. And another one he sang, it's called Dying Under a Woman's Sword. So it's, you know, don't hide behind women's skirts, and, you know, get off to war.
Sihanouk appears on his single covers for sort of wearing fatigue. Is it Ray, the woman singer? She parachutes out of bombers.
She does. Rosare Satir, she was married to sort of someone who's quite high up in the military at that point, and she was sent off to do this sort of media PR stunt, which is paratrooping and jumping out of airplanes.
Yeah. And you say, on the other hand, mimicking English and American accents, which had been banned from the radio as a form of youth defiance in the 50s and 60s, was now allowed under the Lon Nol regime. And the folk songstress Po Vanari had a natural talent for it. The original Cambodian hippie, Vanari, was the first Cambodian woman to play guitar on stage. An iconoclastic band called Drakkar ushered in a harder, more American rock influence thanks to the sounds they emulated from US military radio and their own experience playing for the troops in war-torn Vietnam. Drummer Uk Samath taunted the establishment by performing shirtless, and frontman Tush Tanar picked fights with the audience and other bands on the roster. Sounds quite punk.
Yeah, he is quite punk. My first interview with Tanner was 9 hours straight at a table. We didn't come up for air. And so he was a real motor mouth, but he's just led such a fascinating life, reinvented himself so many different times in so many different guises. He's been a musician, he's been a gem mine sort of oligarch, he's been a shipmate, he's been a quite celebrated scientist, so he's quite an interesting character.
But darker times very much on the way. Khmer Rouge are in the kind of eastern north, aren't they? And this radical communist-inspired movement getting backing from North Vietnam at this point as well, aren't they? And there's been a lot of bad blood created by the American bombings. And so you've basically got a country that's in civil war, right? And you say 300,000 Cambodians are estimated to have died. This is in the first part of 70s. This is before the Khmer Rouge. And this right-wing military government starts to fail, and the Americans, again, pull out. Created them, prop them up, and then they decide we've had enough, we're out. I got the impression it's partly down to, the protests against the Vietnam War in America and in the West, and they pulled out of Vietnam probably for those reasons. An unwinnable war, of course. The same thing, they just basically abandon Phnom Penh.
They do, and actually Vietnam War protests were also in Phnom Penh as well,
right.
because people were dying in Cambodia, so there was a lot of anti-Vietnamese sentiment. There was killings of Vietnamese in Cambodia as well during this time as vengeance. They pulled out, and it left that government, who were grossly under-resourced, grossly outnumbered, very, very vulnerable. And it was by that stage, by the early kind of 1975, it's just the cities that are still holding against the Khmer Rouge.
And then the leader, I think about a year later, he's Lon Nol gets killed.
His brother does. He ends up living out his days in the US, but it's Sirik Matak, who was the kind of puppet master we talked about earlier, who ends up disappearing, and he was the father of one of the people that I got quite close to during the process of writing this book. And it wasn't until actually kind of getting to know his name is Charya that I discovered who his father was.
Right.
I think there was a kind of band of stalwart sort of brothers that kind of in that government that kind of stayed true to the end, went down with the ship, but Lon Nol escaped.
So you say that you began to depend on the Council of Buddhist Mystics, reportedly ordering his helicopters to sprinkle a girdle of consecrated sand around Phnom Penh to protect it from approaching Khmer Rouge forces. Didn't work. On April 17th, 1975, the Khmer Rouge invaded the capital and overthrew Lon Nol. They brought with them an extreme form of Maoist communism, a utopian dream of agrarian life, a classless society of Khmer equals who lived and ate together, a rewriting of history, a return to year zero. Also, Prince Sihanouk catastrophically sort of sided with them, hadn't he, as a way to get back into power. Didn't really seem to be aware of what he was siding with, and they very quickly he was imprisoned in his own palace, pushed aside, and they got on with it. For people who don't know about the killing fields and all that time, I suppose the nearest thing we can probably compare it to is like the Taliban, I suppose. Very hardcore radical extremists coming in and bringing about these almost medieval circumstances, right?
Yeah, they had this vision of sort of this agrarian utopia, and I mean the visionaries, I think, in the Khmer Rouge were what they call the Paraset. They followed the writings of Marx, and then you had this sort of split with the kind of more hard-lined radical side to the Khmer Rouge as well. I mean, it was the Paraset largely that were in power. It wasn't until the last year of their power that Pol Pot became a figurehead. People didn't even know. They just knew Angkor, which was the term for the Khmer Rouge. They didn't even know who Pol Pot was.
And you say that, within hours they began evacuating Phnom Penh. They sort of lie basically to the citizens, don't they? They say the Americans are coming to bomb, so you've got to get out. And they sort of empty the city into the countryside. You've got all these kind of basically metropolitan urban people, different classes, who are kind of forced out of the city into the countryside, and then they're bringing kind of people from the countryside into the city. It is kind of weird reversal and absolutely has catastrophic effects economically and all sorts of other ways. But talk about, in terms of music, what happened to the musicians, people that you'd already talked about.
I mean, it's an estimation that 90% died during the Khmer Rouge of the musicians, because they had what the Khmer Rouge viewed as imperialist views, modern views. It didn't fit their idea of this classless, controllable society. So the musicians hid themselves if they could, but people like Sihanouk were so visible and so well known, there was no hiding.
Yeah, his face was so recognisable.
Exactly.
Right?
There are stories about him being killed pretty much immediately, but we still don't know.
Reported to have been killed in many different places, wasn't there? There's lots of sort of legends almost, or fables about where he died, right?
There was that film, Don't Think I've Forgotten, in 2015, and there was a line from it that his son, Chanchaya, who I interviewed for the book, talks about, I'm told my father died 50 times. How can someone die 50 times? And there are so many different stories about where and when and how he died, and similarly with many others. Sarasate is another one. These are mass graves that are being mapped that, aren't marked. So
some of them may have died just on the road,
exactly.
walking out of the city and into the countryside where they were completely ill-equipped to live, just to survive, that kind of lifestyle. And whether they died on the roads, or in the fields, or were actually shot, it's impossible to know, isn't it?
It is, and I witnessed the tribunal verdict for the Khmer Rouge Brotherhood in 2014 at the War Crimes Court in Cambodia. The evacuation was horrendous. I mean, so many people died. Hospitals were turfed out. People were crawling on streets.
Yeah, it's emptied the hospitals, didn't they?
And there were pregnant women. Sarasate is reported to have lost all of her children on the road. So there's so much that we don't know.
Having been in one of those bands was almost kind of immediately a death sentence, wasn't it? I mean, people lied, of course, about what they'd done, tried to, didn't they? Pretended that they were other things. I think there's a point where just wearing spectacles was a kind of enough to get you executed, wasn't it? As a sort of sign that you were some sort of bourgeois intellectual. And in terms of what happened to music, what then people allowed to sing and perform and even record.
In the rice fields, it's back to the old telephone posts with speakers and propaganda music again, but a different kind of propaganda music, extolling the virtues of Angkor, and the songs have a more traditional folk kind of flavour to them.
You say here, music was another way for the Khmer Rouge to brainwash their slaves with extreme communist ideology, very similar to the Soviet Union. Singers were made to extol glorious Angkor in prescribed lyrics through loudspeakers set on tall poles. The blind bluesman Kong Nai was sent to a village in order to sing his chapés, rhyming in improvised folk protest songs. But they asked me to sing only about their politics, he says. First the Khmer Rouge would tell me a story, and then they would ask me to play the chapé to explain the story to the people. Songs like, the bourgeoisie taking advantage of the poor. That doesn't sound like a swinger, does it? I mean, it's strange because it's 20 years before in the Soviet Union, but it's the same sort of thing, that these really heavy-duty songs, pedagogical, dictatorial, to teach people. They knew the value of culture, of course. They knew the value of music, the power of the song. They were very well aware of that, right? But it was just that it was distorted to a particular political ideology.
Yeah, that's right. Kong Nai was very interesting because the nature of chapé music is that they're the quintessential kind of bard, troubadour. They create their lyrics on the spot. So they have these long intros. And then they have this sort of sitar, kind of cross between a sitar and a lute, the chapé. So during that long intro, they're creating their lyrics for the song. And then they come in, and it's a very kind of, in Kong Nai's case, guttural kind of voice that he has, and it's very bluesy.
You say this thing which reminded me of a particular incident which I came across in the Soviet Union, but you say in another village, Tush Tanar of Drakar, that's the band we talked about earlier, took a great risk when Khmer Rouge officers secretly asked him to sing them old songs from the bygone era, or after a little convincing to play songs by Sin Sisamouth. The Apsara Band, and even American and British songs. On one occasion he picked the light-hearted Obla Di Obla Da by the Beatles, and the soldiers went wild. That reminded me, I think 1940s, Isabel Yureva, who was a so-called Russian tango singer, gypsy tango singer, whose repertoire had been stripped from being about 300 songs to about 12. She wasn't allowed to sing the tango songs, but she was in her apartment one night, and the phone rang, which of course for many people at that time was like the end was coming, so she was absolutely terrified. But a voice said, get dressed, there's a car waiting for you down below, which of course would be terrifying to hear at that time. When she went down, she was driven to the Kremlin and there was a party going on with Stalin and various other people, and she was sitting outside, and she'd been brought along to sing. One of the high-ranking communist apparatchiks said to her, "Comrade, Yureva, don't bother singing the Soviet songs. Sing one from the old days. And then so she went in and she sang gypsy tangos for the Soviet elite, so the same sort of thing. They actually loved those songs and they kind of valued them still. There's a tremendous hypocrisy going on, right?
Absolutely. So funny to hear that, because there was so much of that went on from the stories I heard where, you're presented with this quest and you don't know whether, you're being tested.
Is it a trap?
Is it a trap? Or are they just harking back to the old days and want to relive that? I, obviously never spoke to anyone who fell into the trap because they wouldn't be there to talk to. But, for those that I did speak to, they were tested like that. And there were many more that they talked about falling into those traps and not coming back. If you were summoned to the new village, that was code for you were going to be killed.
You were done, yeah. Dee, we're coming to the end of that story, and just to round it off, I mean, it didn't last that long, did it, actually, the Khmer regime? So maybe you can just tell us, actually, how it came to an end.
It was less than 4 years, but in that time, a quarter of the population died, they estimate. So it was catastrophic, and it was auto-genocide. It was Cambodians killing Cambodians. The Vietnamese came in and, on one hand, liberated, on another hand, was another government coming in to oppress, depending on who you speak to. And the war carried on for right up until 1998. So there was refugee camps that people were making their way to. So, but there was no economy. They were completely decimated Cambodia. So it took up until 1993 to start to see the kind of beginnings of some infrastructure coming back in.
Of the musicians that you met and the ones that survived the Khmer Rouge regime, what happened to them afterwards? I mean, were they allowed back into Phnom Penh? Were they allowed to kind of take up their instruments again? And
some of them made it back to Phnom Penh. One guy I spoke to talked about that time to me. He said, "I want to tell you my story," and his, because he was younger than a lot of the other musicians, his name was Min Sotivan. He talked about the music saving him. He talked about kind of a cadre asking him, if he wanted to play a mandolin, and he played this mandolin, and it kind of saved his life because he ended up living with this cadre and just playing music instead of hoeing the fields. And because he'd been very ill, it really did save his life. On the road back to Phnom Penh afterwards, after the Vietnamese invaded, he finds a guitar and there's about 3 strings on it, and he wants to play "Oh Captain,
I'm your captain closer to home."
That's it. Which is obviously very poetic. A lot of musicians, they got to Phnom Penh, they found that there was no jobs, there was nothing. Lost their homes maybe. So they end up kind of making their way back through the minefields to Thailand, to the refugee camps. Some were sponsored from those refugee camps to other countries, the US. Japan. Others stayed in the refugee camps and then came back to Cambodia, and then others found jobs within kind of the ministry bands, for example. So they found their way back to Phnom Penh.
But I mean, a huge amount of them exterminated, and even the ones who survived, their own families, all their kind of friends have been killed, and so it's sort of absolute desperate time. So, but let's have a tune from the old times just to cheer us up.
This is another cover song by Sin Sistermoot, and this song is The Archies, Sugar Sugar.
It's an amazing book, Dee, and beautifully written, beautifully researched. And as we sort of draw to the end, I thought it'd be great for you to tell us about your odyssey to research and write it, how you came to it and what the process was.
Well, I went in 2012 for the first time to Cambodia, and I had a friend who was working for a newspaper called the Cambodia Daily Post. Hun Sen, autocrat for the last 30 years in power, has closed about 17 media outlets. One of them was the Cambodia Daily Post. But back when I went to see her, it was one of two English word papers. I went to see her, went to fulfill a kind of lifelong dream of going to see the temples, and I went to the south to a mountain which had these sort of colonial remnants of an old hilltop town, kind of elite from Phnom Penh would go to in the kind of 20s and 30s and take in the clear air. There's an abandoned casino there, which is now back in life, called Bokor Hotel, but back in 2012 was just a shell, but it was still covered in bullet marks, and the path had been demined. It was quite a wild place. I walked into this building and there was a Cambodian man next to me with a kind of stereo on his shoulder, and just as we were walking in, this music just filled the room, and it was Procol Harum, White Shade of Pale. That was the melody, but I knew it wasn't the song. It was a cover. It was warped. I just knew instantly it wasn't Procol Harum. But then this voice comes in and it's Sintersmoot. But I didn't know at the time. That was my introduction to Cambodian music, and it was such a kind of otherworldly kind of experience hearing that music. The farfisa was sort of bouncing off the walls, and this voice was just filling this space, and it was this Art Deco kind of cavern. It was very euphoric. One of those moments in life that you just feel this means something. I'd heard about Cambodian rock, and I went back to Phnom Penh. I went and got, basically there were no music shops, so there was a clothes shop that had a guy with a laptop and rewritable discs, and so he downloaded like some digital files and onto these discs. And it was these 3 albums, Cambodian Rocks, 1, 2 and 3. That was my introduction, really. And then I was just so curious because, I think there was a kind of watershed moment with 2015 when that film, Don't Think I've Forgotten, came out. Before then, there was so little information about the artists who made the music. And I was so captivated by that voice, and I wanted to know who he was. And then that grew into this just curiosity. I started going to the British Library and started seeing what I could find there and digging around, and realised that actually the only way I was going to kind of uncover this story was going back to Cambodia. And I had a lot of conflict because I wanted a Cambodian to write this story, but, and I wanted to read it. And then there's that lovely Toni Morrison quote of, if there's a book that hasn't been written that you want to read, then you must write it.
Yeah, that's great.
That was my calling, I guess. I just felt my own personal curiosity spiraled into this sort of almost a duty when I kind of had saved that money, gone back in 2014 to do the research, spent 6 months out there. Interviewing people, travelling around.
You don't speak Khmer?
I speak a tiny bit. In Khmer you say dik dik. I had Khmer lessons every week at this wonderful Cambodian NGO that is in typically kind of Cambodian fashion, is kind of, it's got this split sort of goal where it has on one end it's to teach foreigners how to speak Khmer, Cambodian language. On the other side, it's also a creche for sex workers' kids. So we would learn in the red light district on these little tiny kids' plastic chairs. I learnt enough if I was in the provinces alone, and I had to find my way back. I could do that.
And you could use local translators. And
I used exactly. And it was the translators that was so much a part of this journey. And I'm just trying to kind of work with one of the translators now to go back out and deliver the books to the people with him. Because he was so much a part of my journey. Saporn Lim, his name was.
Sounds really similar to my experience in writing bone music. My Russian's negligible, can get me down to the subway and back. But I used a lot of amazing people who helped me, not just to actually translate, but to help me find people as well. I'm sure you had the same thing where you're trying to meet somebody you've heard of in some distant town and hunt them down. And it's a rather wonderful process, as well, isn't it? And I think that you mentioned something earlier, and with regard to the Toni Morrison quote, and I had a strange experience, of course, too, because particularly when our exhibition went to Moscow, bone music, I felt like, well, I'm an English guy, it's like, isn't that a bit sort of impertinent at least? Shouldn't you be doing this? The curator of Garage, which is the Museum of Contemporary Art in Gorky Park, I asked her that question, and she said to me, if you're a Russian guy, you wouldn't be sitting here. Which I took in sort of two different ways, because it seemed a bit damning on one hand, but also I think sometimes it takes outsiders to maybe recognise the value of the story with this programme. I mean, I like to collect stories and pass on other people's stories, and sometimes it does take outsiders to actually do that, and you did that with this book, didn't you? Maybe, it was too close, too painful. Who knows, whatever, for a Cambodian to write it. It took your sort of fascination, your passion and curiosity coming to it, and that first inspirational moment of hearing the tune in the casino, the abandoned casino, which propelled you into it. And sometimes maybe that's what it takes.
Yeah, I agree. And it's so interesting hearing the parallels. But I think probably the two most profound moments for me in this journey were talking to it. There was a couple of people I interviewed. One was Tuch Chata, who he was part of the Draka band, and he said to me, thank you so much for doing this. I don't have time to write my story. And and then another one, Taxali, who was a sort of recluse, sort of turned his back on music after the Khmer Rouge. He was so traumatized. And, sort of for some people, I think, the kind of soundtrack of Cambodia still remains this music today, that 60s, 70s sound you hear everywhere. And for some people, it's a wonderful thing to return to something before that time. But I think for others, he turned his back and he created a family and he moved out the city and he, kind of had this other life after. But he said to me at the end, thank you for telling my story, because I've held this inside for so long. I think it was really validating for him to tell his story in front of all of his family. He had, generations of his family around him while he told his story, and they knew very little about his past and what a kind of god he was. He was revered as this sort of guitar virtuoso hero, untouchable, almost mythical. Yeah, really, really touching moments. So many people are so traumatized by what's happened. And
also I think that, a lot of that music, which was Western influenced, so it is quite fitting in a way that you, as a Westerner, came back and completed the loop, right?
Beginning, I sort of felt this conflict about writing a straight-up music book as an outsider. And I think it moved into something more personal and something that I could write only from my perspective, which was a travelogue, for that reason, because it felt like the most respectful way to write this story.
So it's your story too?
Yeah.
DEE PEYOK, thanks for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Thank you, Stephen.
Away from Beloved Lover, published by Granta in the UK, is Dee's amazing book. I'm sure you've picked it up from that. What a read it is. It's very touching for me because I felt some parallels with Dee in terms of how I'd come across the story of bone music, not being a writer or a researcher, just being a musician really, and whilst travelling, finding a record, which sent me on a crazy journey. And in Dee's case, this is a journey really into the heart of darkness and light. I am going to include, if you join our newsletter, I'll send you Dee's amazing Spotify playlist of Cambodian music from all the eras we discussed. Thanks very much for listening and supporting us. bureauoflostculture.com if you want more. See you next time. We're going to finish with that track which first inspired Dee in that abandoned casino, Synthesimus cover version of Whiter Shade of Pale. I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying to pronounce the Khmer version of it, but here it is. See you next time.
Hãy subscribe cho kênh Ghiền Mì Gõ để không bỏ lỡ ប់ចិត្ត